Jesus was a rock star.
God, we are in a series. Next week is the last week. We're going to be in this series, and we're doing a book club. I read this book last summer. I said I want to share this with our whole church. And so we've been looking at this, taking a chapter or two of these principles: vision, divine focus, and unmistakable camaraderie, friendship, innovative minds, willingness to fall short will be next week. Today is heart's focus outward and kingdom mindedness. So I'm kind of looking forward to today. Had a little bit of fun with this. This is mind map. That QR code will bring up this entire series, and this should work the whole time. But today we're looking at kingdom mindedness. What comes to your mind when you think of kingdom mindedness? Like a throne room? No, what I'm talking about when we say kingdom mindedness is we're interested in the kingdom of God. And how do we get along with Christians? Because we have a job to do, right? The church is God's plan to reach this world. Sometimes I look at the state of the church and I wonder if we can do that well, if we're going to rise to what God wants from the church or not, because sometimes the church gets a little broke, but that's because we're still kind of broke. But kingdom mindedness, we got to get along with each other. But we also should get along with other churches and denominations and work together. And so I go to a prayer meeting once a week on Tuesday mornings. Charles and I both go to that. Anton, our kids guy, he goes to it sometimes. And it's fantastic. There's people from different kinds of churches there. I have friends that I wouldn't have other places because our paths wouldn't otherwise cross. This last Thursday, I was at the Evangelical Leaders Network, and it was just still long to say. It used to be the Fargo Moorhead Evangelical Ministers Association. So that took even longer to say. So I guess it got a little easier to say. But I was there, so I got to be with other pastors and things. And I think that our churches need to be friends. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit today because I think it's really important. Now, of course, anything that we talk about other churches, the same applies for each other, okay? And so Jesus had things that division hurts the heart of God. Do you believe that today? That there's got two people that both love Jesus, but they maybe don't look at some things the same, and they get kind of in a fight. And Jesus said he knew their thoughts, and he said, any kingdom divided by civil war is doomed. A family splinters by feuding and will fall apart. Now, sometimes the world knows more about our church conflicts than they do about the Jesus that we're supposed to be talking about. We can get so caught up in this little point and that little point. And I stumbled on when I was studying this, I stumbled onto somebody fun. This is Richard Baxter. Now, he lived at the time of the English Civil War, like the 1600s, right in there someplace. And he was a minister, and he was known as a peacemaker. He was known as a guy that did not like conflict. And he had this quote, and I had never heard of him until I stumbled across this quote. He said, it is not enough that all the world, or is it not enough? Is it not enough that the whole world is against us? Of course, there's a lot of persecution at this time. At this time in history, there were people in the Christian world that didn't think you should read the Bible, so they're burning people at the stake and things, and it was a very tough time. But must we also be against one another? The world is against us, and yet we can't get along. Check this out. Oh, happy days of persecution, which drove us together in love, whom the sunshine of liberty and prosperity crumbles into dust by our contention. He's saying, I wish we had some persecution. Because when the world was coming against us, we came together on something. We weren't so petty. We weren't so small. We weren't so concerned. Now, there's a principle here. that I hope that you walk away with from. Now, we're going to talk about a particular denomination in a little bit, but I really don't care if you learn about that denomination today. What I really want you to hear is, how do we interact with people who disagree with us, particularly in the things about God. Now, you may have heard me say this before because I find myself saying a lot, and I like the little story that I'm about to tell you because it puts me in a frame of mind of humility. And when I tell other people this story, it displays a humble point of view from me, okay? Just so you know, it does those two things. I hope I remember to say that again. It puts me in a humble state of mind, and it tells them that I'm humble too. And that story is this: I'm looking forward to seeing my Jesus face to face. I hope you are too. There's going to come a day when you're going to come into heaven, and there he's going to be. Now, that song, I Can Only Imagine, he says, I don't know if I'll fall down at your feet or if I'll dance with you. And I have to agree with that. I don't know how I'm going to respond to Jesus. I mean, it's going to be heaven. It's going to be eternal. Am I just going to fall on my knees for 10,000 years before I finally get up? But at some point in time, however long it takes, and I get up and I look at Jesus, and we're done hugging, and I've gotten control of my emotions. I don't think he's going to set me back and say, Scott, you're the one. You're the one. I'm like, what do you mean, Jesus? What do you mean I'm the one? You're the one. Of all of the Christians who have ever lived, of all of the theologians, you were right. You got it, man. Now, did anybody watch that show where, I wish I remember what it was called, Better Off Dead? Anyway, in this show, the theology was really bad, but in this show, there was heaven and hell. It was a sitcom. The guy from Cheers was in it. There was heaven and hell, and it was very bad theology. But there's one thing that I thought was really funny, because in the office of one of the I think it was one of the angels, in the office of one of the angels, he turned out to be a demon later, but that was a plot twist in a future season. There was this picture of this dorky looking guy, and so there This guy is in the office of this angel, and he says, well, who is that? He says, that's Leo. Leo was right. Of all the people who ever lived, he knew exactly what heaven was going to be like. He knew exactly what hell was going to be like. He knew exactly how it worked. Well, when I see Jesus, I don't think he's going to look at me and say, Pastor Scott, what you thought about everything, how creation happened, how sin is, all of it, how and when we're saved, all of it. You were right. I don't think he's going to say that. Now, I think the doctrine's important, and I feel strongly about doctrine. I wish more Christians cared about doctrine, to be totally honest with you. But I don't think that I'm right about everything. I don't know where I'm wrong, and there are some doctrines that I feel more strongly about than others. Can I give you a couple of examples? Doctrines that I do not feel strongly about. I do not feel strongly about pre-trib or not. Okay, now I sign a document every year that says I believe in a pre-tribulation rapture. That means that before Jesus comes or before the tribulation happens, I'm going to meet him in the air. Okay, you know. But to be honest with you, if he doesn't, that's not going to hurt me too bad because I'm just going to keep on serving him as good as I know how, and it's just going to pan out. But I believe in that, but I don't feel real strong. About that. Now, there are some doctrines that I feel really strongly about. One is that it's by Jesus I'm saved. That's a pretty important doctrine. Jesus is God. That's a really important doctrine. And I hope that if there ever came a situation where you put a gun to my head and said, deny that Jesus is God or die, I hope I would have the courage to die. I don't know that you know until you're there. I think you get extra grace. When I read about saints who've given their life for Christ, they seem to have incredible courage. So I think there's a gift of faith that you get at that moment. But I would die that Jesus is God. I would die that he died for my sins. I also, now this might be different than you. I hope that I would also have the courage to die to say that the Bible is absolutely true. That is another one that I hope that I would die for. You know, but after that, I can't think of a lot that really screamed out loud in my mind that if you put a gun to my head, I'm not quite sure that is Genesis a 7-day literal creation, or is it a metaphor? I happen to believe it was a 7-day creation. We can talk about that. But if I get to heaven, and I find out that Genesis chapter 2 is a metaphor, and that when God was visiting with Moses on Mount Sinai, and I get to heaven, and Jesus says, well, actually, it's a metaphor, because it would have just taken too long to tell Moses otherwise. He was running out of room on his scroll that he was writing on. It's not going to change my theology at all, not even a little bit. And so I don't think that I'm always right. And I've noticed that when I'm with somebody, even if they're not even a Christian, if I tell them that little story, because when I tell that story about getting to heaven, seeing Jesus, and then saying that there's some things I believe that I would die for, some things I believe, when you get through with that, you've accomplished a couple of things. Even if you've never talked to a Christian before, right? That person I'm talking to, even if they're a Wiccan or if they're a Muslim, somebody that's very, very far from the Christian faith, they know what I believe about Jesus. They know what really matters to me. But then I make a big deal out of the fact that there's some things that I might be wrong about. And I don't demand that they agree with me, but I use that playful little thing. I hope I would die for these beliefs. These are the beliefs that really matter to me. I would die for them. And when I articulate that and they listen to that, but I am all what it really does something magical in the conversation. And you can steal my story if you want, because it really works pretty good. Because all of a sudden, our conversation is not an argument, it's a conversation. And it's amazing. Once your conversation becomes a contest, you might as well get out of the conversation, because you're not going to accomplish anything. It doesn't matter what you're arguing about. But the moment that your conversation, there's going to be a winner and a loser, in the conversation, you're not going to change anybody's mind. Anybody's mind. So so this is what I find fascinating, and this is how's my time. I'm doing pretty good for time. Inger Lisa was in Washington D.C. recently, and there were protests. They were using garbage trucks either to control the protests, or the protesters had stolen the garbage trucks. No, I don't know. Anyway, but they're blocking streets with garbage trucks. And we were in Washington, I think it was last summer, and they were there. Spray painted on the memorials and on the statues and stuff. And at one point we were walking, and the people that were protesting were screaming and they're yelling and they're just angry. And I thought, they're not changing anybody. Like, no person ever said, ha, that guy spray painted a statue I love. They must be right. Has that ever happened? Ever in the history of man? Has somebody cussed somebody out and said, you're an idiot, you're a bigot, you're a Nazi, you're all these things? And say, you know what? You're right. I'm going to change my ways. Not once in the history of man. Now, the civil rights movement worked, but did you know that that was incredibly different? Watching a documentary of that, and I'm sure you studied the civil rights movement. But a pivotal moment in the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, they would stand peacefully in traffic. They did do that, but and they wouldn't move. That was one thing that they did. And then they would come out with batons and stuff. But according to this documentary I was watching, they brought their wives and their children out there. And so they stood out there and they sang Christian songs. They weren't yelling people down. They were peaceful and they were Christian and they were singing Christian songs, and then they came out to move them, and then they beat the women and children as they were, and then that got filled by the TV, and that was a turning point, according to this documentary, in the civil rights movement when they got all of that press. And so, because you could see courage in these people, and Gandhi and all that. So our culture now of protesting with hate, I'm sorry, they're stupid, because there's not one mind that has ever been changed by that. Now, that's true. Why do we think as Christians that somehow by yelling louder than the world and meaner than the world that we're going to have any success at all? It's stupid to think that that would be successful. And I just want to encourage you that we can be humble and bold at the same time. Both of people that are far, far away from God, and who and are very very different belief system than us. But also with Christians from other denominations. Now, I'm going to talk about a denomination, but I just want to show you what it looks like for us to have fellowship with somebody. Now, in my mind, by the way, you can disagree with me on what I'm about to say. You have permission to disagree. I'm not right about everything. I'm the one preaching today. And so some of the things I'm going to say in the next few minutes are not right out of the Bible, because this organization didn't exist in the times of the Bible. So you're allowed to disagree with me. But this is my opinion. When I was studying to become a pastor, and I was required to read a book, and I don't know if they still require this book or not, but it was called the Kingdom of Cults. Was the name of the book, and it listed all of the cults in there, and they looked at different religions, and they told you why it was a cult and all these things. And in the appendix of this book was listed the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so now they didn't get a whole chapter, okay? But they were covered in the appendix. And it was listed as a cult. And now I don't know so much about the history of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but I grew up just knowing that they were a cult. I didn't quite know why they were a cult, but they're listed in this book, and so I just figured they were. And so then as I got older, I had a pastor friend whose daughter was marrying a guy who was Seventh-day Adventist. And at first, because he was, he read the same book, Kingdom of Cults, he said, whoa, I better check this out. So he began to study a little bit the Seventh-day Adventist. And then so we were in a staff meeting, and he shared how they had, his daughter, he said, but I just can't find where they're a cult, he said. And so, oh, that's interesting. And so then a few years ago, and I didn't interact, we do have a Seventh-day Adventist here in Fargo, and we actually have a pretty good guy who's a Seventh-day Adventist church. He came to our prayer meeting one time, our Tuesday morning prayer meeting. He's Seventh-day Adventist. And so we had the conversation. Somebody said, well, aren't they a cult? So this is very fresh. And in preparation for you, so then I discovered they're actually it's kind of hard to say they're called. Now we have some distinctions, but actually, I would personally. I would call a Catholic person a Christian. You can find Jesus there because they believe that Jesus is God. He died on the cross. He rose from the dead, and because of that, we are saved. That they believe that. Now, do we differ in a lot of things? Absolutely. The Reformation happened. Okay, but in my book, and again, there's no litmus test in the Bible for what a real Christian looks like, but in my world, I will call you Christian brother or sister if you believe that Jesus is God. He died on the cross and he rose from the dead, and because of that, you get to live forever with Jesus. That is the core thing that you got to know to be a Christian in my worldview. Okay. Well, you know what? The Seventh Day Adventists believe all those things. So why are they considered a cult? Well, they do believe in Saturday worship. And you know what I was told when I was young? I was told that they believe that if you don't go to church on Saturdays and you go on Sundays instead, you're